Christine, Renee wanted me to let you know that she's running late because she has a previous engagement at work, I guess, that isn't ending when she thought it would. So
You guys are on streaming.
Okay, let's call this meeting to order. Even though it's a informal study session, Madam Clerk, let's just go ahead and call a roll so that we have a record.
It would help if I was on mute. All right, so we know Mayor Weber is excused for this meeting. Councillor Beta.
Here.
Councillor Cassett.
Here.
Councillor Garcia.
Present.
Councillor Lindell.
Here.
Councillor Rivera.
here.
Councillor Romero-Worth.
Here.
Councillor Vigil Coppler is also excused this evening. And I will note that Councilwoman Villarreal will be joining us as she's able. So with that, Mayor Pro Tem, you do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you very much. I haven't seen a formal agenda for this meeting. My understanding, though, is this will be the format of the meeting. I believe either Councillor Romero-Worth or Councillor Abeyta will have opening comments, perhaps both. And then we will move to presentation of a slide deck by Mr. Guillen. And after that, we will have discussion or questions, and we will have a hard stop at 7. So Councillor Romero-Worth or Councillor Abeyta, were one of the two of you prepared to make some opening remarks on this?
Yeah, I can get started because I think what you may remember, Councilwoman Lindell, actually, were our first year in office, around maybe 7 or 8 months into the term, we had a meeting with the city manager and the mayor, and they presented this huge slide deck about good governance, right? And we kind of chuckled because we were like, "What is this?" But basically, it was kind of what we learned the first 9 months in office, and all the meetings and all the procedures and the process that we've had to go through. And it's kind of like, can we be more efficient as a governing body and as a city? And so I started thinking about an exercise or a project I did as the county manager with the League of Women Voters, but that was around transparency. And I thought to myself, and I think the mayor got a little offended or hurt with us, Councillor, because we kind of went at him about his good governance. And it's like, don't we have more important things we got to deal with? But as we gave more thought to it, it's like, there is something to being more efficient as a governing body, and maybe we could take up these initiatives and start working on it. So I reached out to the League of Women Voters because, again, I had worked with them at the county, and they were real instrumental in taking a look at how government runs, and they had their thoughts and ideas. And so I asked if we could make a presentation to them about the city and how we could become more efficient as the governing body of the city and mayor. And Councilwoman Romero-Worth, you joined me at that meeting with the league where we presented some of these ideas and concepts. And I think you and I even got into an argument about one of the initiatives or something. And I was like, okay, well, let's work on this together. Let's do it. Let's take a shot at looking at the process we follow and changes we could make. And then as we got that initiative going, Councilwoman Cassett was like, I'm interested in that, and I want to help. And so that's really what this is. We've been working as a group with Attorney McSherry and with Jesse, and we've been looking at the procedures and the rules and seeing how can we become more efficient as a governing body, because ultimately it benefits the public who we are in office for and are serving in. And I think want to see things a little more efficient. So with that, I want to thank the staff, because we have been working on this for quite some time now, and Councilwoman Romero-Worth and Cassette for dedicating the time weekly with us to be looking at these and having the discussion. And we think where it's in we think we're getting to the point where we need the rest of your buy-in on this, and ultimately, hopefully, adoption, so that, like I said, we do become more efficient as a governing body, because ultimately that's what's going to serve the residents best and make Santa Fe a better place to live in the long run. So that's my spill and the history and background behind that.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Romero Worth.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I would just add to that, we did also have Jennifer Fabian when she was with us, helped, was part of the staff group that was helping. I think it was that slide deck, that good governance slide deck, had a variety of recommendations. Things like, what should the signing authority be of the city manager, and how do we effectively refer bills to committees and get the work done in a way that makes the best use of everybody's time, staff time, counselor time. And so this is one of those pieces. And I think another big focus of the changes that you'll see once Jesse starts walking through is that we wanted to provide the public with an opportunity to comment and be part of the legislative process sooner. And so you'll notice some changes there. Right now, the way it works is we don't do public comment until the bill is on final passage at the governing body. It's already moved through the committees. And so one of the things we wanted to do is give an opportunity for public comment on the front end of a bill's journey through our process, so that we could act on some of those suggestions earlier, because by the time we get to final passage, we usually can't do a whole lot to address particular issues that may come up. And so I would just say that the public commenting period or provisions are really important piece of all of this. And also want to give Councillor Cassett a chance to speak, Madam Pro Tem, because she's been an integral part of this process and trying to figure it out. Very exciting to be at this moment. And I'd also thank all the staff that has helped us.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cassett.
Thank you very much, Mayor Pro Tem, and thank you both to Councillor Beta and Councillor Romero Worth for this work and letting me jump in as you guys had already started. As Councillor Romero Worth was just speaking, I think one of the parts that I'm most excited about is our ability to really integrate the public comment in, as it'll be happening earlier. But I also think that it's given the new structure that we're proposing provides a better opportunity for us as a governing body, as councilors, to really dissect and look at legislation and work together within the committee process to be creating something that's in a more final form by the time it gets to governing body. I know a lot of times we'll get to governing body and spend those meetings trying to make this thing something that we want to pass, but this will really give us a lot more opportunity for some more thoughtful conversation and research. And ultimately, the goal is to be passing better policy, to be better serving the city. So, and thank you, to the staff. This was a heavy lift. We were meeting weekly for months, for an hour every Monday, and it was a lot. So really huge kudos to Jesse and to Aaron and to Christine. And Jennifer's no longer with us, but she was so key in the beginning. And I just really want to recognize all of the hours that went into creating this. So I will stop there and we'll jump on in. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So, Mr. Guillen, are you ready to start with your slide deck and to share your screen with us?
I am. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, Councillor.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I noticed the newly elected Councilwoman Chavez had been included on the invitation list for this meeting. I don't know if she's here or not, And then I asked for Counselor Garcia to be included in this as well. And I don't see that he's on either. But are we going to have this meeting again after the first of the year to include them in the procedural rules?
I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps City Attorney McSherry has a comment. I really don't know.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, I see Clerk Bustos Mihalzik has her hand up too, so I don't know if she has the background information. I think regardless which procedural rules are in effect when the new year starts, we'll need to do training with the new counselors, whichever rules are in place. So I think we're planning to do that, and other training as well. So
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Counselor?
I don't know. Miss Mihalzik wanted to say something since her hand is up.
I also just wanted to know, I actually did not include originally Counselor-elect Chavez, as she is not yet sworn in. However, I do want to note that after our conversation, I did provide a YouTube link for Counselor Chavez and elect Chavez, and also Counselor-elect Garcia to participate. And I did let them know that if they joined this Zoom meeting, they could view the meeting, but that this is actually a study session for our current governing body. So I do just want to clarify that we did discuss, I did provide the links after our conversation, but it was not I who initially involved the additional elect counselor. Just for
Yes, I do appreciate all the work that's been done, and clearly we'll go through the meeting tonight, but just wondering if it would have been more appropriate to do after the first of the year, but clearly we'll move forward and they'll deal, I guess, with whatever we decide.
And
So,
also just to counselor, I apologize, to reiterate, we will have another training for both for new counselors, and then based on what is or is not approved by this governing body, there will be council trainings in the new year.
and it'll just be for those two.
No, we'll do something similar that has probably a recap of things again for all counselors as we're evolving our training and retreat practices, I think, for governing body members.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Okay, any other questions?
Mayor Pro Tem,
I can't, okay. Counselor Romero-Worth?
yeah, and I don't know, maybe Counselor Cassett was going to address this, but I think here's the thinking. We, as a group, we're trying to decide how best to handle this, whether to do this after the first of the year with new counselors or do it with the current group that we have. And I think the thinking is this group has a lot of experience under their belt about what has been working for the council and what has not been working. And so we thought it best to try to move these changes through before the end of the year so that they will be in place when the new counselors come in. And then the training for the new counselors can be done based on a whole new process. And they just start off with that process like we all did. We all came into office and we, were given the process that was there. We inherited the process that was there. Now, if we can get this done before the end of the year, and I think we are in the best position to comment about the process and to make changes to the process. If after the first of the year, there are other changes that we decide need to be made, these processes can continue to evolve. But I think our thinking was if we can get it through with the people who've been working under this system for a number of years and have the best position, the best sense of how the rules are and aren't working for us, that would be the best way to go. And those are our new counselors can't participate yet because they're not sworn in. But I used to watch the city council meetings as a as a newly elected counselor just to see what was going on. And I think that's great if they are here and they are listening, because it just helps get your feet under you for when you actually are sworn in. So just wanted to make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Mr. Guillen, let's proceed.
Mayor Pro Tem, I've got a question on that point, though.
I'm sorry, Counselor, I'm not where I
Okay,
can see
I'll hold off.
hands
I'll
up.
hold off.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Counselor.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I mean, I think I've got some of the same concerns maybe that Councilor Rivera has, in the sense that this probably is a conversation that we can have, but the ultimate passage is probably best suited for the new counselors. I think, given that this is going to be a rule set they have to abide by, there's no time frame that's really putting us under pressure to pass this. And with all due respect to Councilor Beta, whose term is ending at the end of the year, I understand that, but I think there's no reason why we couldn't include the new counselors in deciding the process that they're going to be a part of. I think it's not affording them the opportunity off the bat is not a way we should start off their term. To Councilor Romero's point of that, we all came into rule set. That's absolutely true, but we didn't come into rule sets that were changed the month prior to us coming on board. When as I mentioned, there's no reason for us to hold off. We couldn't hold off onto having this on the agenda in January. We can talk about this in committee, but I think ultimate passage should wait until January on this. Just given our current circumstances. That's all I got, Mayor Pro Tem.
I'll just remind everybody that this is a study session. It's a presentation of material. We're not looking at voting. We have a presentation, and then we can ask questions on the material presented. And Ms. McSherry, is your hand up?
Pro Tem Lindell, I did raise it, but I think we should probably proceed with presentation.
Yeah, let's proceed. This is a
moving.
study session. It's informational, and it's 5:20 already, and it's time for us to listen to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me 1 minute while I do that. So I wanted to just give an overview of the proposed changes. Like Mayor Pro Tem Lindell mentioned, this is a study session. I'm just going to go through it. We do have limited time, so if you could first hold off on questions until the end, and second of all, if we can, I think we're all open for discussion on this, but if we can hold off on the merits of any particular aspect of it until it actually goes through the committee process and the governing body, I think that would make sure that we can stay within this 2-hour time frame. So with that, I will start.
Jesse, is your proposal in Prime Gov? Because it's pretty hard to read.
I'll zoom in on all of these, and no, it's not in Prime Gov.
Okay.
But I'll zoom in so you can read it. So, so the goals, as we work through it, were to clarify certain procedures that have caused confusion. As was mentioned earlier, provide the public with an earlier opportunity to comment on bills. To also update the order of business to be more in line with what is common practice, as well as to meet some of the desires of the sponsors. Increase specificity on the motions, because there has been confusion over the years on that. And then also define a committee process related to legislation. Current rules talk about a committee review process, but that's not delineated anywhere, so it's not anything that's really clear. So strategies that we use to accomplish these goals, one was to research what other municipalities do. So as was mentioned earlier, I do want to credit Jen with doing a lot of that research. She was very helpful in looking at a lot of different municipalities and how they are tackling the issue of efficiency and public participation. We also looked at the shortcomings of our current rules, pitfalls, and lack of clarity. And then brainstorm creative solutions that work for us. So we could look at what other municipalities do. Maybe we want to take that and put it into our own system, but maybe there's some part about it that didn't quite work. So we tried to figure out ways that we can incorporate all that into our own process. So a brief overview of the changes. If you've read through the proposed changes, you probably will have noticed some of these. We moved some of the existing material around to create a more understandable document, make it more streamlined. An example of this is in the current rules, all the information under relating to executive session is in the order of meeting. So it muddies up that section. So we pulled that out into its own section. We established definitions which don't currently exist. We created a committee process, which I talked about, including the earlier public comment. We added a section on decorum. We established a study session as an official meeting type, along with regular, special, and emergency. We revised the meeting order. For example, actually, I'll talk about this later. So including now the request to publish is not, it's not automatic, and I'll talk about that also later. Created a section on recusing yourself from a vote, what the requirements are for that, when you should do it. We expanded and clarified the main motion and debate section. And then we also changed the vote required for suspension of the rules from a majority to a 2/3 majority. 2/3 majority is what Robert's rules created. There is what Robert's rules says, so this is in line with that. So primary changes to the agenda. We combined the afternoon and evening sessions, so there aren't separate sections of the agenda now. We put minutes on the consent agenda. So if there are changes, it would be just like any other item on consent that you wanted to pull off. Upcoming public hearings, which is a section that Christine had started doing several months ago, 6 months or so ago, is now going to go under communications from the city clerk as opposed to at the very end of the agenda. We put introduction of legislation as its own section after communications from the governing body. One thing that we did not change is that petitions from the floor are still scheduled at 7. There's an additional section for public input, which is the first public comment on bills. We delineated public hearings for legislation from other types like land use cases and appeals, and we moved appointments to the end of the agenda. So I'm just going to quickly go through what our current process is and then what the proposed process is. And then Jen did these slides probably 1.5 years ago, and I have tweaked them based on what we've ended up proposing. So this is how bills go through the committee process at this point. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Subject matter advisory committees, depending on the content, city council standing committees, the request to publish, and then the public hearing. And then we have, if it's a time sensitive issue, and then the land use rezoning, which is its own process. Resolutions are similar, except there's no request to publish. We may need a waiver of the procedural rules if it's an emergency or a time sensitive issue. And then contracts. This is similar, except there's no introduction, goes to committee and then governing body. The proposed idea for bills, proposals for bills can come from different areas. They can come from a study session. They can come from advisory committees like the closed captioning bill that was recently adopted. It could come from the council or the mayor or a staff recommendation. So it'd be governing body introduction, The next step would be that public comment at governing body. That's the next step in the process, which really allows the public to be engaged earlier in the process, allows you all to take those comments that are provided and potentially integrate them into the legislation as an amendment or some other change. From there, it goes to the relevant committees, and then back to governing body for the public hearing, which includes another opportunity for the public to comment. And the governing body could choose to refer it back to a previous committee or a new one if it so chooses. And so there are providing multiple opportunities for public comment. Resolution, there's not going to be a first public comment like there is with the bills. There are opportunities for public engagement, but they're written only via PrimeGov, so you can submit comments on PrimeGov. Not all committees do that. Some allow verbal public comment, some don't allow any comment, but the governing body will allow, or does allow, and will continue to allow public comment on resolutions as well as bills, written, at least for resolutions. Contracts process doesn't really change here. There's no public engagement on these. So let's go into the legislative process a little more closely here. So there's the introduction of legislation. So that's, as I mentioned, its own section now on the agenda. And the primary sponsor can take up to 3 minutes to explain their proposed legislation. Any co-sponsors will have a minute. And any other governing body members who want to sign on as co-sponsors can do so. At this point, are up until 72 hours before the meeting. So sometimes councilors will sign on as sponsors when the legislation is adopted, which can just creates more work for staff. So we're trying to have them sign on earlier. You're also not listed on the agenda as a sponsor if you sign on when it's adopted. So that's a benefit to you as well. During the introduction, there aren't any questions, discussion, or debate. It's simply entering the legislation into the record. As Councillor Cassett mentioned, and I think this was the item that brought her into the discussion, was that legislation must be fully drafted and signed by the city attorney prior to introduction. So this is probably the biggest, one of the biggest changes from our current process, and really I think will streamline how we get things to committee. It will make staff lives easier, I think, including Aaron, who won't have to rush to review and sign something that's supposed to go on a committee the next week. So that's one of the big changes there. And then a slight tweak here. Right now, legislative staff essentially sets a committee schedule, but we're going to work more closely with the primary sponsor to determine which committees and dates that the legislation goes to. Next, committee review. So it must, in order to get on the governing body agenda, it has to be approved by at least one committee. If it's approved by all the committees to which it's referred, it goes on consent. If it doesn't, if there's no recommendation or denial at one committee and approval at the other, it will go on discussion. And that's only resolutions, not for bills. We're establishing more of a linear process. So order of committees will be the standing or the advisory committees or any other task forces or ad hoc committees. Then it will go to quality of life or public works and utilities, then finance, and then finally governing body. So that will allow 9 days between finance and governing body for any final changes or anything that needs to be done to be prepared prior to governing body. We're going to a little more detail about the public comment process, which is a new change. So as I mentioned earlier, meeting after the introduction, the bill will have a first public comment. So the intent is to allow the public to comment on the bill before it's really been to any committee and allow those comments to be potentially incorporated via amendments if it's some legitimate concern that is raised. This is so that we're not scrambling at the last minute at the public hearing when the item is to be voted on, scrambling to make amendments based on something that you may have heard by the public. But there is no discussion or comment by members. It's just an opportunity to listen to the public provide their input. The only exception to this is if there are two sort of exceptions in the rules, which exist in current rules as well. For uncommon circumstances, or if there's an emergency, this step may be skipped. And then lastly, after it goes through the other committees, it will go to the public hearing. So as you probably mentioned on the order of business, we're going to have two different sections for public hearings. The first is for legislation. The second is for land use cases and or appeals. And so this provides a final opportunity for public comment, just like we have now. It can be written or provided verbally. And then one small change here is that we're not going to require a specific address of the speaker like we do now. We're going to ask that they either state their council district, or if they don't know that, then their street of residence, so that you all have some idea of where the constituent resides and if they're one of your constituents. You may take greater interest in what they're saying if it's one of your constituents. And then our current rules don't have any established process for amendments, so we're putting that in there as well. So they have to be written and provided as early on in the process as possible. If they're not discussed at committee, so if they're proposed at governing body, they need to be presented in writing. So this is maybe a little more difficult when we're virtual, as opposed to in person, where you can just write it out on a piece of paper and then have it copied and distributed. My suggestion in this case would be just to submit something to me via email, and then I can distribute it to the rest of the governing body. So if we go that route. One of the main changes in terms of legislation, or in terms of amendments, is that let's say an item is at Public Works and an amendment is approved to a resolution. So now you have a resolution, you have an amendment, and that's approved by that committee. Then it goes on to quality of life. That amendment is now attached to that legislation. So if quality of life decides that they're okay with that amendment and they want to keep it, then they're gonna make the motion to approve it. Not to approve as amended, but to approve it. If for whatever reason quality of life decides they don't like that amendment, there's going to have to be a specific motion to strip those amendments from the legislation. The process right now is when amendments are voted on at committee, it's more of a recommendation. Whether they're approved or denied, they're still loosely attached to the legislation until it gets to governing body, which there really is a final determination of whether or not they're approved or not. And so that is my presentation, and I will stop sharing, but I can go back to any of this if people have specific questions. So thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Ginn. I think probably the best way to do this is to, someone will put their hand up and we can start and we'll go through, and I would ask people to be mindful of the amount of time that they take with their questions. There are numerous people here, and it's past 5:30, so I can't see whose hand is up. If you want to give me a wave and let me know that you have questions, we'll start with the questions. No questions?
Mayor
Oh,
Pro Tem.
Councilor Rivera.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Jesse, you talked about introduction of legislation, and it said governing body introduction with regards to ordinances and resolutions. Yet that has been something that in certain situations or circumstances, introductions have taken place one of the three major committees. Is that what you mean by governing body, that those three, finance, public works, and quality of life, are included as governing body?
Jesse, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Rivera. Our current rules are legislation is supposed to be introduced at governing body. However, when legislation has been introduced at committee, it's for a time-sensitive reason, and that could be a waiver of the rules. And so that's why when it gets to governing body, there is a vote prior to discussion to waive the rules to allow that introduction at the committee level. So that is still an option.
So what would happen in those situations where it really wasn't an emergency, it was just something introduced maybe because councilor or the mayor forgot to introduce it at governing body? So if it didn't meet the criteria of really being an emergency.
I will maybe defer to Aaron on this, but I think that is either a decision by the city manager or to allow that or not, or maybe Aaron can weigh in on that.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Rivera, I think the way they're written currently, we'd have to do a waiver of the rules. So that might be something to talk about if we want to be more flexible on that. I think the goal of introduction at governing body and allowing the counselor who's sponsoring to be able to speak about it up front is to give the public and your colleagues notice of what the intent of legislation is as early as possible before it goes to committee, before potential amendments are proposed, before this first public comment occurs. So the whole idea is to try to avoid those situations as much as possible, which I think we try to do now as much as possible as well. Thankfully, we haven't had a lot of those situations, but I think thinking of those outlier situations and how we'll handle them is a really good type of thing to be considering.
Well, I think it happens more frequently than not. So should we look at maybe writing that into the procedural rules instead of just trying to kind of deal with it on the fly when it comes up?
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor, I think that we can certainly address that. And as these are our draft rules, so they're not necessarily the ones that will be included in the packet for committees, because we are taking this study session as providing feedback on what is currently drafted. And so we can certainly discuss what you just mentioned and see if that's something that we want to specifically address.
All right, and then you talked about legislation going through the committee process. And I think you mentioned that it would, and I don't know if this was a new recommendation, that would have to go through all three committees to get on the governing body agenda. That's not what you said.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Rivera, I apologize if I wasn't clear on that. I was more outlining the order in which the item would go. So it would go to advisory committees first, and then either Public Works or Quality of Life, depending on the subject matter, and then Finance. So it's there's sort of a setup of the order in which they would go, but they wouldn't necessarily have to go to all three unless the item related to all three of those committees.
Counselor, can I address that?
Sure.
So I think our thinking is, we do have a specific section that talks about referrals. Right now, Jesse makes the referrals to committees, and we have, we've looked at other processes. We looked at, the legislature, they have specific people in leadership who make the referral to committees. We don't really have that structure or that those roles. And so we were trying to figure out, how do you refer bills to committee? And so what we decided was that staff, i.e. Jesse and maybe Aaron, would work with the sponsor, and it would be predominantly by their subject matter. So if it deals with, let's say, housing, it would go to quality of life. And if it has a fiscal impact, then it would also go to finance, but there would be no need for it to go to public utilities. And while I'm on the subject, I know we have had a lot of legislation go to public utilities to try to make sure that all the counselors were able to see the bills at the committee level, where we have been trying to do the work, so that we're not taking up valuable council governing body time on the night of our meetings. And we do have another change that we'll be bringing forward. We can't do it in these rules. But we will have an ordinance change. And what we'd like to suggest is that the president, or not the president pro tem, sorry, wrong governing body, the mayor pro tem would serve on only one committee, and that committee would be finance. And therefore, we wouldn't have the problem we have now, where we have one counselor who only sits on one committee and sometimes doesn't get to hear all the things that were going on. So we wanted to address that issue. And then with the referral of the bills, make sure that we are using the committees and the committee staff that goes with those committees in the best way possible. So we would refer the bills to the subject matter committees, to the finance committee if it had a fiscal impact, and then it would have to pass one of the committees to which it was referred in order to go on the governing body agenda. And I see Erin's raising her hand, so maybe I've misspoken somewhere along the line, and I would defer to her at this point.
Councilor Pro Tem Lindell and or Councilor Mayor Pro Tem Lindell and Councilor Meredith, nothing that you didn't misspeak. I just wanted to add one thing, which is an additional step that we've put into, I think, the proposal, which is that the sponsoring counselor would determine which committees are subject matter appropriate. But if at the time of introduction, the council disagrees with those referrals, that objection can be raised at that time as a challenge to the referrals, and a vote on either additional or alternative referrals can be made at that time. So if, maybe something had a fiscal impact and it wasn't identified initially, and the counselors say, like, wait a second, we think that needs to go to finance, and you didn't refer it to finance, we'd like to amend that referral. That opportunity is there. Right now, it's just not really clear who decides right now.
Right.
So
thank you for that. And just to let you all know, Councilor Lindell has had to step away for a bit, so I'll be running the meeting. So back to you, Councilor Rivera.
Thank you, Councilor Merworth. So if you're running, do I have to call you Madam Mayor Pro Tem?
I'm not the pro tem, so don't call me that.
So in that situation you described, with the pro tem only being on finance, that kind of sets up the situation we have now, where you have a counselor, a decision maker only on one committee, which we currently have right now. So if that person introduces legislation and wants it to go to the committee that they're on, and I can't say that the situation may change after January 1st. Would that not be appropriate, I guess, so that they can have a say in their own legislation?
So you mean if the pro tem had the mayor pro tem had a piece of legislation and they didn't refer it to, and it didn't belong at finance, but they put it there because that's the committee that they sat on? Is that the
Correct.
hypothetical? Yeah. So again, this change we will be talking about separately, because we can't make it through these procedural rules. And I guess the thinking was the mayor pro tem, because they are mayor pro tem, probably has the best sense of overall what's going on, and there is, because of our number, there is always one counselor who will be only sitting on one committee. And, I think we all know that this has been, caused some hard feelings, and, it's just the nature of what we have. Somebody has to only serve on one. And we thought if it were the mayor pro tem, it would be somebody who is otherwise in the know about lots of things, the general running of the city, and therefore wouldn't feel ostracized. But I think, again, you could, to the city attorney's point, you could always challenge if, the referral wasn't correct. And the council could say, that referral isn't appropriate, or we want to change the referral. So I think it would create less problems than what we have, but, I think we'd have to see.
Okay. And did I hear, I just want to be clear in my mind that not everything has to go through finance. Is that correct?
I don't know who should answer, Jesse.
Councilor Marworth, Councilor Rivera, that I believe that's true. I'm trying to find the page on this. The exception to that is that Finance Committee must review all legislation with a fiscal impact, which is really no change from how it currently is. So,
right.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be some expenditure or some revenue coming in, but it has to have some sort of fiscal impact, even if there's no money changing hands.
Yeah. Thanks. And recently we've had the issue of passing legislation with no recommendation. Is that actually a pass that can move on to the governing body, or is that?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell and Councilor Rivera, I think I actually may have accidentally skipped past that slide. I did have a slide of the different motions. No recommendation is going to be an option. However, that does not meet the criteria for approval in terms of getting it on the governing body agenda. So if it's referred to two committees and both committees do a no recommendation, that it's not going to get on the governing body agenda. At least one has to approve it. And if you'll indulge me for a minute, I think I did skip that slide because there's one additional change in terms of motions and votes and related to that, and that's that we're creating a way for a committee to essentially kill legislation, and that's by unanimous denial. So a committee could deny an item 3-2 and it'll still move on, but it will say that it was denied. However, if the vote is 5-0 to deny it, then that stops the legislation right there. It's not going to go anywhere. So that's a change from our current procedures.
All right, Ms. McSherry. So if you make a motion to move an item forward without a recommendation, you're moving it forward, but you're not ready to actually vote on it. And I think that's the situation that we were involved in. So we want it to go forward to governing body. We're just not, maybe we need additional information, or staff may ask for additional time to provide that. If we make the motion to move it forward, does that then not move it forward?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell and Councilor Rivera, the other thing that's in here is this express recognition of the ability of a committee to postpone to a date certain if there's not enough information to make a vote, either affirmatively or against it. And so the idea is if there's not enough information, then the committee should see it again or refer it to another committee that would obtain that information. So the recommendation of the sponsors is that in terms of whether it goes to governing body or not, that at least one committee should have at least supported it by a simple majority.
Mayor Pro Tem, can I jump in on this question real quick?
Go ahead, Counselor.
Thank you. Councilor Rivera, I think one part that I'm not sure was clear, because we had a lot of discussion on that exact question. And to your point, sometimes we just need more information, and it doesn't mean we necessarily want to vote it down. We are proposing that we move to a linear process. So right now, there's not really a way to hold a bill in a committee without that bill moving forward. It already, I think we experienced this recently with something that we wanted it to stop, and we wanted more time to work on it, and we didn't want it to move on to finance. And we didn't quite have that ability. I think we somehow made it work. I think Councilor Beta simply took it off the finance agenda out of respect for the Quality of Life Committee wanting to do this work. With these proposals, the committee process becomes linear. So it will not move on if, say, Quality of Life decides that they want to hold that bill for one additional committee meeting in order to describe exactly what you were saying, to get more information from staff, if there's something that we feel that we're not able to vote on it at this time. If we, because we're looking at the calendar, decide we do as a committee want to move it forward, we still do have that option to move forward without recommendation, but this does give us the option to stop it at a committee, to do work on it, to get more information without it continuing to move forward, which we don't really have a mechanism for that that's very clear right now.
So on that note, then, based on, I mean, you could have a block of counselors in that could stop legislation from moving forward at all.
You sure could. And we actually, I mean, we kind of do have, we've seen that happen recently in Quality of Life and Finance. There is a block of us that because the three of us sit on the same committee, we've stopped legislation that has gone to both Quality of Life and Finance because that's their appropriate assignment. So yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sure you're about to say that we can only hold it for one extra committee meeting. And at that point, it does have to move on. So it either, if it gets killed by a unanimous vote of 5, because that's the majority of the governing body, or we can hold it for one additional committee meeting. But to your point, so that people are not using that as a mechanism, we did write in there that it's only one additional committee meeting, and then it has to be acted on and will move on unless it's unanimously killed by a 5-member vote.
And if I can add, the only way that you can kill a bill is if all 5 members of a committee say no. I believe that's, and the thinking is that's the number of votes on the governing body, 5, that would be required to kill a bill if it got there. So if it's gonna die when it gets to governing body, why prolong the agony? If you've got a committee of 5 that says no, because you know that bill's not going to get passed when it gets to governing body. So I don't know, Erin, did I misstate?
I'm usually just wanting to add. Mayor Pro Tem Lindell and Councilor Merworth, so it would require the 5-0 for killing a bill in committee, but just like our current rules, and our current rules say that at least one committee needs to recommend approval. So it says, that is the word, recommend approval. That is the same as now under the current proposal. But if we want, and so under that scenario, if a bill were referred to 2 committees and both committees do not recommend approval, then that item would not show up on a governing body agenda, that is consistent with the current practice as well. But if we would like to change that, that's something to talk about.
But what I'm hearing now is that one committee decided to kill a bill, that bill would be killed and not go to the other recommended committee. Or maybe the other 5 would, be in favor of it.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell.
Not likely. Because, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There's only 9 of us of voting members, right? So there's only 4 additional people who could be for it.
Yeah, I've changed my mind on a bill before that came to committee, and then once more information and the public spoke about it, I changed my mind about it. And this doesn't seem to really give us that option. And again, that's, it's just a concern of mine. So I'll move on because I know we're busy and there's a lot of us that probably have more questions. There was a comment that was made that a bill cannot move forward unless it's signed by the city attorney. I assume that means or your representative in some cases, because I've seen Marcos, I've seen Andrea sign bills on your behalf. I don't assume that means that it has to be, everything has to be signed by you.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Rivera, that's correct. The code also says I prosecute all cases and sign all contracts, et cetera. And so it says I can designate as well. Yeah.
All right, is that specified in the rules that we're talking about?
Councilor Lindell, or Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Rivera, it's not. But that's how we've applied the ordinances that provide the same type of requirement.
All right. And then Jesse, you mentioned something about changes to decorum, but I didn't see anything in the presentation.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell and Councilor Rivera, it was more about a new section, and you're right, I wanted to highlight the main some other sections. The whole decorum section is essentially new. There's not a decorum section currently existing in our rules. I think there's maybe one paragraph about public decorum. What we've added is more about decorum for the governing body members.
Can you point to what page that's in the proposed legislation so I can review it while I ask questions?
It's on page 8 of the Prime Gov version. And I would say this is one of the places where we learned from other cities that have such a section that talks about decorum of the membership of the governing body. And some of this language was taken from what we have seen in other cities. And it seemed like something that would help us operate at a higher level.
Okay, I'll review it again while others ask questions. So with that, Mayor Pro Tem, I'll relinquish the floor.
Thank you, Councilor Rivera. Councilor Garcia?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Lindell. First, I guess I'll go, because I had it on my list, I'll go back to what Councilor Rivera was talking about, since it's kind of still fresh in our minds in regards to a committee being able to kill legislation. And, I have some of the same concerns my colleague brought up, but my additional concerns are it doesn't afford the opportunity for amendments to be made for future committees to consider that legislation, and maybe it wouldn't be killed. I think that we really put ourselves in that predicament. If a committee doesn't want something to pass, they can deny it and say we don't recommend it, but we shouldn't be able to kill legislation in committee. We should afford all opportunities to get the work done, as folks have said in the past, in committee. That way, should it go to governing body, it's been given all opportunities for revisions and refinement. Because as Councilor Rivera mentioned, there has been legislation in one committee, I voted against it, but then there were amendments made and I voted for it. By the time it made to governing body, I was in full support of it. So I think we really need to think of that and maybe make that change. I guess a couple housekeeping things first before I get into questions. These new proposed rules are not on the public version of Prime Gov. So I want to make that clear. All that there is the resolution and the prior rules and procedures. So the public has no idea in regards to what we're talking about this new proposed legislation. It was mentioned before that a lot of this is done for better governance for the public. So with that being said, we need to include in future packets a strike through version of these proposed rule changes. The public has to be able to clearly delineate what is new, what is old, what's being taken away. Without that, the public doesn't know. And so we need to incorporate that into, at minimum, our first committee meeting, whenever that takes place, and throughout the rest of the process. again, as I mentioned in my opening comments, these are rules that are not only going to govern us, but they're also going to govern the public as well when it comes to public participation. So I strongly encourage us to have a public hearing on the matter. We need to understand how the public feels in regards to the rules that we're changing and how it applies to them. We need to afford the opportunity for the public to participate in the process that is ultimately going to be guiding the process that they will be participating in the future. With that, I do have I guess, a question about the amendments, because from what Jesse kind of quickly went through, Jesse, can we quickly go through that again just before I ask my question in regards to approving amendments in the committee process? Can we kind of go through that again? Or am I understanding that if committees vote down, which can ultimately mean three counselors, they can control the amendment process, 3 counselors. So I want to clearly understand this process.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Garcia, the process, yeah. So if something is not approved at the committee, if it's a 3-2 vote, then it sort of acts like it is right now, where it still floats along with legislation, but it's not considered incorporated into the actual text. So it could, you could bring it up again at the next committee at that point, but it wouldn't be considered incorporated into the legislation if it was denied at the previous committee.
Okay, so then with that, thank you so much, Jesse. With that same train of thought, if it's approved in committee, then it's incorporated into the legislation.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Garcia, that is correct.
Okay, so then still with that same train of thought, 3 counselors can ultimately incorporate amendments into legislation if it's not the majority, which I think we need to change. That it should be always a majority of the governing body approves amendments, not 3.
Mayor Lindell, Councilor Garcia, that would only be at the committee level. So once it got to the governing body, it would take 5. If there were 5 votes to strip that amendment, then they could do it at that point. So I don't think that we're permitting 3 people of putting in something that the majority doesn't want of the whole.
So then I guess my question to that is then how is that making it more efficient if it's you're then having to take that additional step? I think it's just somewhat maybe potentially complicating the process a little more in that instance, because we then have to unpack amendments that potentially 3 counselors made.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Garcia, I think what our intention was here is to actually establish a process for amendments, which doesn't currently exist. There's no, you propose amendments at a committee level and they're approved or they're not approved, but in either way, they still go on to the next meeting, whether it's another committee or governing body, and they're not truly incorporated and approved in relation to that legislation until the governing body takes action on it. And so we're trying to address that shortcoming in our rules that are silent on amendments and provide a process that addresses them. So certainly, the merits of what we've put in here can be discussed, but that's what we've spent time discussing. So
thank you, Jesse. I appreciate that. I mean, I agree. The amendment process definitely needs to be refined and revised, but I think we're not making the process more efficient in that sense, because again, you can have 3 folks that approve something that then requires the governing body to unpack it later. When if it didn't require the full 5 at the front end, we wouldn't be in that predicament. I guess my next question is the referral to committees by the staff or sponsor. And we kind of had the discussion already about, potentially having folks miss hearing or hearing an item for one reason or another. And I think that can be abused by a potential sponsor in that sense. I think if, a potential sponsor doesn't want somebody to hear it, let's say, for example, if it's the person that's only on one committee, then the sponsor can control that process to say, I don't want it to, for example, in the current process, I don't want it to go to Public Works and Utilities. And we're going to bypass that committee, which, has happened currently with this current process. And I think that's where, in my opinion, I think it's better up left to an independent state, which would be staff, to determine we should better set criteria that would outline how staff would dictate where particular items go. I mean, I think we all know that anything financial related goes to finance, but then we determine how staff would then use the direction given from us on how to refer other committees in a clear and equitable manner. Because I think by allowing for a sponsor to refer it themselves, it allows for that to be abused. And what we don't want is for, since we were talking about good governance, we want to take away any type of ways where we can abuse the process. I think,
Councilor
the
Garcia,
other,
can I respond to that before you move to the next one?
sure,
Go ahead,
absolutely.
Counselor.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. We had that discussion as well. If people were trying to bypass the process and not go to the appropriate subject matter committees or to finance because they wanted either to avoid a certain committee or make sure that certain people that they thought would be friendlier would see it, even if it was not the appropriate committee. So at the time of introduction, that schedule will be posted and we'll see as a governing body where it is referred to. And then as a governing body, we can challenge that schedule and say, no, this needs to go to public utilities. This is absolutely a public utilities, or this is absolutely a quality of life, or this has a fiscal impact. And then with a majority vote of the governing body, we have the opportunity to override that schedule to really check and balance ourselves and to make sure that we are sending things to the appropriate committee. So that was because we had that exact same concern, and that was the check that we are proposing is put in place there.
On that point, Mayor Pro Tem, if it's okay with Councilor Garcia.
Go ahead, Counselor.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Cassett, for that. So if in the situation that you just described, I guess, let me see how I want to frame my question. We're going to start having votes on the introduction of legislation.
Mhm.
So it's going to have to be listed as an action item in order to be able to adjust the schedule potentially.
I would defer to the city attorney on that one.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Rivera, it's not an action item, but there's a procedural option to challenge the assignment. So on the agenda,
But if there's going to be a vote on that, if there's going to be a vote on that assignment, it has to be listed as an action item.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Rivera, the topic of discussion has to be on the agenda under the Open Meetings Act. And then any further rules about our agenda are in our procedural rules. So this is a rule that we're talking about as a proposal, which would be that introductions would be listed on the agenda individually. So each introduction of each piece of legislation would be listed on the agenda. So discussion on that would be okay under the Open Meetings Act, but our procedural rules would limit that discussion to an introduction by the sponsor, a description of the committees to which it would be referred, comments by co-sponsors, and then the opportunity to object by counselors. So that would all be about that subject, and that subject would be on the agenda, and our procedural rules would describe what would be appropriate in terms of the conversation about that subject.
And then it would be voted on.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Rivera, only if there was a challenge would there be a vote. Other than that, it would just be announced similar to how it is currently, but there'd be a specific opportunity to talk a little bit about it. But the proposed rules as written currently, and these are all just proposals for the purpose of discussion and to get this type of feedback, say that there would not be discussion about the item. The only thing that's contemplated is a challenge of the assignment to committees.
And thereby a vote only on the referrals. So we would either be voting to approve the current referrals, or a motion could be made to change the referrals, in which case we'd be changing the referrals, but not on the substance of the legislation.
Yeah, I get that, but since it's going to be, there's the potential to vote on even the change in what committees it goes to, it's going to have to be listed as a discussion item or as an action item, because clearly we're going to be, there's the potential to have to vote on it. So I don't want to take up all Councilor Garcia's time, so I just wanted to make that point. Thank you, Councilor.
Councilor Garcia, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. And Councilor Rivera brings up a good point in the vote, but to kind of piggyback up on that as well is what's to stop a coalition of councilors from still blocking a vote. I mean, I think, again, we need to do everything we can to take this type of authority away from the councilors and put this in staff. What we need to do is develop the tools to have staff appropriately guide them to the appropriate committees. I think that's the better tool we need to put in our tool belt, not create another vote for us when, if there are coalitions built, we already know how votes are going to go, and it's pointless in that sense. I think,
Mayor Pro Tem, may I just address that briefly?
Go ahead.
So the current process is that it's staff. So it's my office that determines the committee assignment, and that's based on the relevant committees, on the subject matter of the legislation. So if you look in Chapter 2 of City Code 2-1.13, it talks about the various standing committees, and it goes into detail about the oversight of the 3 city council standing committees. So legislation is referred to those based on what their oversight is. I was actually the one who wanted this changed because I sometimes get in trouble by members because they don't like the assignments that I give to them. So I would like this to get off of my plate. I don't want to be involved in the political side of it. And this is a political decision. So I would like, in many cases, I mean, I guess it doesn't have to be a political decision, and it shouldn't be, but it can turn into one. So I would like to step away from that. And so that's why we decided to have the sponsors input in that. And so we work with them and base it on the same criteria that I base it on, but it's more on the sponsor's plate.
Thank you for that background info, Jesse. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Is we're taking it from a non-political process to an absolute political process. And I think that's what, when we're trying to develop good policy, good government, we need to try to do it in the most fair and equitable manner possible. And I completely understand and feel for you, Jesse, that you've been put under pressure for one reason or another why things were referred to a committee. But that's why, as I mentioned, we need to provide you with the proper tools. That way you or whomever it is can point to the direction and say, don't be upset at me, be upset at this process that I have to follow. And you are then just following the process that through our policies you're following. Because if there is justification for some reason or another to send it to another committee, then we can bring that up as a governing body measure in the political measure, in the political realm. I think this is very concerning. This part of having the sponsor be able to kind of dictate where it goes is very concerning in that sense. I do have more questions. I want to respect others' times. I'll wait for the committee process, but I will again reiterate There needs to be a strike-through version for the public to fully understand what the changes are. And I am strongly recommending that there be a public hearing on this matter, given that there are implications that affect the public. It's not solely changes that are going to affect the governing body. The public is going to be affected by these proposed rule changes as well. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mayor Pro Tem Lindell. I'll relinquish the floor.
Here, but if I may just respond to the request for a red line. I did have a couple of requests for a red line, including from you, Councilor Garcia, and I'd just like to note that it's not really amendments to the current rules because we are making a lot of changes. We're moving sections around, we're adding new sections. If I were to provide a red line, it would be even more confusing than just reading the two and seeing what's different. There's really nothing to redline because the sections are moved around into different areas. And so it's really not a viable product to provide a red line.
Mayor Pro Tem, if I may respond to that.
I guess I'm back in charge of the meeting. Sorry, I didn't realize. Mayor Pro Tem Lindell. Yeah, briefly, Councilor Garcia, and then we need to go to Councilor Villarreal.
Yeah, and Jesse, I do understand that it'd be challenging, but I think with the document that was previously or currently 13 pages, and it's now being beefed up to 21 pages, that's a lot of changes. And I think a lot can get missed if you fully don't understand and are an expert in what our current rules are and what's being taken away and what's being added. And that's why it's critical. We need to be as fully transparent, not only with us as the governing body members, but with the public in regards to what these proposed changes are all about. It's critical that we fully understand and demonstrate what these changes are. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
You're on mute.
Thank you, Councilor. I see Councilor Villarreal has joined the meeting. Did you have some questions you wanted to ask, Councilor?
Yes, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Lindell. And I apologize for our delay. We had a longer CDC meeting to make selections for the Alto Street property. So it was a good meeting, but we went over. So I don't have the presentation. I just requested it. I'll have to look at it later. So I don't know what you presented, Jesse. So if I repeat something that you were ask questions about, bear with me because I didn't get to see your presentation. Let's see. I think I'm still fuzzy about this piece about how a committee could kill a bill. And, you know, part of it's also because we don't know where we're going to be assigned and who gets assigned to what committees. And that will actually be an influencer too. So I'll just say that it's hard to kind of figure out what that would look like. I think the part that I'm always trying to figure out, the procedural part is hard for me, but I think the part that I'm confused about is so assigning committees. I agree with Jesse has been put in situations that are uncomfortable, and I understand that makes sense, and we want to avoid that. I think what is hard for me to figure out is, sure, there's certain committees that it should go to, but what I've seen in the past is it's assigned to certain committees, but it's a lot longer down the way, even though the bill's ready to go or the resolution's ready to go, and then other people's legislation gets assigned more quickly. So how do we avoid that?
Councilwoman, I'm not sure I understand the question. So you're saying
It gets assigned to committees, right?
yeah. So and I think the word we should use is how legislation is referred to committees.
refer to committees.
Yeah.
But there's times that those referrals are not, I know there's a timing issue, but there's times that the legislation's ready to go and it gets assigned a lot later, like even in maybe the next month or later. And then there's certain legislation that also gets introduced at the same time and it somehow gets assigned or it gets referred to committees sooner.
I see City Attorney McSherry's hand up.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, councilors. I know at least one scenario where this occurs. There might be others, because at least the intended assignments, I think, are included when legislation is introduced, at least right now. But sometimes the problem now is that the legislation isn't required to be fully drafted in the packet ready before introduction. So there's certainly times where something is actually already has the FIR signed and that kind of thing when it's introduced, and then we can actually get it in the packet on time. But sometimes that isn't the case. And if there's questions amongst the various staff involved, whether it's the staff writing the memo and finance who's signing FIR and my office that's signing the FIR, if we're not all on the same page early enough after introduction to get it to committee, then it doesn't get on that committee. So that certainly can delay certain ones. And one of the requirements that Justy talked about that I think these sponsors were interested in is making sure that all legislation has the same start time so that that situation is avoided. Basically, when it's introduced, the whole packet would also be ready at that point, like the FIR and the signed legislation. So then we know it's ready to refer to committee. So that way we don't realize, sometimes I haven't seen it at all when it's been introduced, and sometimes the finance department hasn't seen something at all. And so then there could be questions going back and forth about the FIR, about what the intent is. And then we aren't able to coordinate within those like couple days that we have to sometimes to get on a committee. So that's at least one reason why that might happen currently that I think a different change is hoping to address.
Well, that's definitely one example. I think there's times that everything's complete and it just gets assigned later on and other things get assigned in that month for those committees. So I just want to avoid that. It's hard to see something that's ready to go that you're waiting on, that you've been working a period of time, and then you see it later on down the way and you're like, well, I guess that's not important. It happens. We can't deny it doesn't happen, y'all. It happens. And then we see things that are just coming to us and it's half baked. So I appreciate that this is, we're trying to standardize that where it's complete. And that means all governing body, right? Mayor included. Everybody has to have it complete before it goes to get to us, correct?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal, that is correct.
Yeah, I just want to, I don't know how to resolve that issue about making sure that even though it's referred to committees that it's ready to go, that it doesn't get delayed because I don't know, someone else decided that something else was more important to get to us.
But I think, Counselor, if I can, at introduction, it will give its referrals and it'll give the dates as well, won't it, Jesse? So I think there's that sort of accountability, if you will, and the fact that it's all there, the packet material's there, the thing is fully drafted, it's been signed off as to form by the city attorney's office, suggests that there can be no reason for the delay. So if your bill was supposed to be at quality of life the next Wednesday and it's not, I think then you can point to why was my bill bumped? Because we know it's not because it wasn't ready and it didn't have the appropriate things, because it said when it was introduced, it was supposed to be at quality of life on this day. And so I think it will help that process, because right now, we just want to make sure that when it's introduced, we introduce a caption. A lot of times there's no legislation that's even finished yet. So I think our intent was to try to deal with, making sure that we're ready to go when it's introduced.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would maybe just be helpful before it gets to that point of introduction of just Jesse confirming the dates with us via email, maybe, I don't know. So, because sometimes it might be ready to go for that next quality of life, but then it's set for the next quality of life in the next month. So I just want to make sure that we don't get delayed, even though we're ready to go. Because other people have, I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know how that works in terms of Prime Gov. And, so as the quality of life chair, just as an example, when I had staff, we used to look at, all right, what has been assigned to this committee so that we could say, all right, we know we have all this stuff. And then we want to add a presentation. How much, can we add this presentation? Is it too much with the other pieces of legislation we already know are coming? And if the bill is at introduction is ready to go and it says what committees it'll go to on those dates, I think, that should help the Prime Gov, schedule, because it's just automatically in there. And as a chair, then I look at all the stuff that's automatically been put at the committee. And then that's my starting point for how I look at what kind of room the committee has to add other things like presentations that we're interested in. So I think this will help that problem.
Who keeps that master list? Jesse, do you look at the list of what things are on each committee already, or how do you keep track of that?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Viadel, I don't have a list of, I don't separate it out by committee. I separate it out by the item itself. So I have a spreadsheet that lists all the committees that a certain item is referred to. So unless I actually went through and counted, I wouldn't be able to tell you how many things are referred to a specific committee. Whereas if Councilor Romero Worth or staff in particular goes into the agenda itself, then they can quickly see how many items are on an agenda.
Okay, so you're just going by the time frame, the time frame that we have in order to get the packet material onto that committee with sufficient timing. Is that how you look at it?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Viadel, I schedule it based on, as I mentioned, the subject matter, but also, if I just received a draft of it, or maybe I just have a caption, I don't actually have the legislation, then I may need to push that first hearing out, because it takes time to draft the legislation, to review it with the sponsor, to find the appropriate staff, to get the memo and FIR completed, have Aaron review it, and then have Aaron and Mary sign it. So it's a long process. And so the goal of having legislation completed and signed by Aaron at the time of introduction is that all of that is done prior to introduction. So when it's introduced, if you don't have the memo and FIR, it's at least in the hands of the staff member that will draft it and while on its way. So this will help me, and it will help you as well to know exactly what date. And obviously we will work with the sponsor as is in the proposal to figure out the committees as well as the dates. So it's not just figuring out the committees it's going to, but also which dates, specific meetings it's going to.
And is priority given just based on the timing that people introduce it?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Viadel, I currently work on a process of how it was, the order in which it was received. The exception to that is if there's going to be some, harm to the city or we lose money or something like that, then those are bumped up to the front. If there's a grant we're going to lose or something like that, then those are given priority, because there is going to be actual harm to the city. But if there's no emergency, or it's not a time sensitive issue, then it's done in the order it's received. But that also varies. It could be something very simple like supporting an item of legislation at the state, or it could be a brand new section of code that's creating a whole new law. So those are going to take different periods of time. I may get the request for a new section before the request for a resolution in support of something, but the resolution I can knock out in an hour. So that will get done before the bill is done.
And so Erin, how do you all decide when you're signing off on stuff? And how do you prioritize that?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal. So I think Jesse made a lot of good points. And so when he sends me legislation, I often have questions for staff about, is this the name of this program? That kind of stuff, what does this mean? Is this an existing whatever, can we define this term? So that adds a step, right? So then they've got to get back to me. And so what I do them in an order that I receive from Jesse, unless he's told me, I often have to, he can tell you this. I meet with him on a weekly basis and I say, what are my priorities? He literally has to give me, help me reorder my priorities on a weekly basis. And he helps me talk through that. Because there's certain things, and we take into account all this stuff. We have this information, we don't have this information. So if we don't have certain information, then I am not going to spend all my time on something that we know we can't move forward without that information. But he and Jeff really helped me figure out what my priorities are for their subject matter, which is all the legislation. And he sometimes sends me a midweek thing saying here's what I've got waiting for you. And that's really helpful, and he'll order it in the order. So he helps me set my priorities as well. But sometimes once I've given feedback, then it's kind of put it off my plate for then until I get, until I hear back on those questions so that we can move it forward. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. And I actually appreciate your thoroughness and looking up things and verifying terms. And I think that's helpful. That's part of the process. I guess I'm just wondering how it gets in the queue to you. And that's just something that's always this anomaly for me. How does that happen? How did it get to, I just never quite understand it. I think it's helpful that we'll have a complete packet before that happens. So I think that's been a challenge, things that have been moving forward and you're how did that get even forwarded when it wasn't even complete? So yeah, I guess I just have to maybe understand that better with Jesse about how that's prioritized in a systematic way versus somebody that just keeps telling you, you need to get this through, Jesse. So that's, yeah, I think we'll have to circle back on that another time. Let's see. There's I'm going through the new document, and I did actually ask for a red line as well. I didn't want it to be, I understand strike throughs and all that and moving sections wouldn't make sense, but I think just new language, putting it in red saying this is new language, and also words that you changed. I don't really care about where it was moved in the order that it was placed in the document. I think it's more what was added. And I actually like that section that you added for decorum. I think it's important. And I just assumed that was new just because I went back and forth from the old document to the new document. And we did need to update our old document for sure. It was not really complete. It was kind of out of date in my opinion. So I think it's good that we're looking at this new version. But if you could just send us a version that shows red text means it's new, and any new language so that we can really kind of see it and compare it without going back and forth to these documents. Does that make sense?
Councilor Villarreal, yes, it may be quite the laborious process, and I am off next week, but I will attempt to work on that.
I think it'd just be helpful and more clear about what was changed. And also that presentation probably would be helpful. And I haven't seen it. So if that, when I get that, I'll be able to kind of look at that from just a holistic point of view.
I did email you a link, so we should.
Okay, thank you. The other thing was about just curious about why we have a 72-hour co-sponsor requirement. And I bring this up because there's sometimes legislation that works through committee, but there has to be amendments. And then when we get it at the governing body in its full form with the amendments, and we're looking at it in the full holistic way, then there's times that I'll speak for myself that I personally want to co-sponsor. So if you could give me rationale about 72 hours. And then the scenario gave, how do we adjust that for certain circumstances?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal, I guess maybe I'll ask you to clarify what you mean by certain circumstances later, but the
Like
rationale.
I just described, just the example I just gave you, but.
Oh, okay. And maybe Councilor Merriworth wants to speak to this as well, because this was something that she was brought up also. But from my point of view, it makes it a lot easier in terms of finalizing legislation if I know ahead of time who the sponsors are. The other benefit for you, and I mentioned this during the presentation, which I knew you missed, was that if you only add, if someone only adds themselves on as a co-sponsor at the time of adoption, especially if it's a bill or an ordinance, it's not going to show up anywhere. It's not going to be on the agenda. So you may sign on, but you're really not going to get credit for doing so. And
What do you mean it won't show up anywhere?
Well, because it's not on the agenda.
Right.
The agenda's already been published. Ordinances don't list sponsors, so that's obviously not going to show it. And we add you on to resolutions if you do it at the time of adoption. But in terms of, it doesn't show up on the agenda. So I think you're taking credit away from yourself if you don't do it sooner than that. So.
Well, I hear you about that. I guess there's just times that it just, because of the nature of the legislation, co-sponsoring later on makes sense. And in the past, we would actually, the city clerk at the time would add us, and it wasn't a big deal. And I know there's certain things that's changed. The one thing that I don't really see anymore either is that we'd actually sign the legislation when we were co-sponsors, and we don't do that anymore. So even things that I co-sponsor in advance, I have no idea if my name's actually on there because we don't see it. And so I'm trying to figure out, how can we actually see things? I'm not saying last minute like you're talking about, but even things that we co-sponsor ahead of time, I don't ever see that. And it kind of worries me because I'm like, oh, I wonder if I was a co-sponsor, because when we were in person, we signed things. We had our name on it and we saw it. And now we don't see it. And I brought this up before, but I don't really know. I didn't really get a clear answer about like how we track that co-sponsorships.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Vieira, I don't know if that was a question or.
It is. I don't know too, though.
Well, if I am notified or hear that someone wants to be a co-sponsor, then I will add them. Occasionally, I know people just tell the city clerk, and then she tells me. So that's how we track the sponsors. But the agendas are always updated with new sponsors. It can be difficult to update legislation once it's signed because it is a protected document in Adobe. So it takes multiple steps in order to change out that first sheet to add additional sponsors. And so part of it is just decreasing the staff time and work required to do that. I know that's not justification for saying you can only add yourselves on when it's introduced, but we are trying to push that towards the beginning.
I'm going to interrupt and just remind everyone that we have a hard stop at 7. And selfishly, I would like to ask some questions also. So if we can move along a little bit, that would be appreciated.
Mayor Pro Tem, can I say something on this one? And then I think maybe one of the
Go
sponsors
ahead.
had something on it too. I just want to quickly say that a lot of the additions are to fill kind of vacuums that we often get asked a question like, how do we deal with co-sponsorships? And the answer is just like the best we're able to, because we don't really have a process. So I think we're having to kind of make something up in the absence of a direction from the governing body. So some of the proposals are kind of filling those vacuums where we don't really have guidance. So there is a proposal on the table that would fill that vacuum. And I think the sponsors are looking for feedback on what that proposal is. And then it would be nice to have guidance on some of these areas, just to fill that gap.
And if I can really quickly add just two things. One, with regard to the red line, I would encourage those who are looking for a red line, just read through the rules. And I think the biggest thing is, does it make sense? Can you see where we have made changes to address a lot of the things that we have been having trouble with? And see if it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense and you can think of a different way to do it, we'd be interested in hearing that different way. We did do a lot of research about what other cities do to handle, to the city attorney's point, some of the things that we have a vacuum in where we don't have any rules. We certainly look to the legislature a little bit about how they move legislation through in a way that, seems to make sense. Not all their stuff is good and worth modeling, but some of it is. And just to this specific point about sponsorship, sponsors tend to be the people who worked on the legislation. I think in some instances, it's maybe something like the $15 an hour increase for city employees. It was something that we all believed in and we knew it immediately. And so we all signed on. But, things like the short-term rental bill, things like this bill, we have spent an inordinate amount of time shaping this legislation, doing the research of this legislation, figuring out places where there were policy decisions to be made. And therefore, we are sponsors and co-sponsors. And I think, we're all welcome to help and make legislation better and claim a rightful spot as a co-sponsor, but it seems like it should be done not in the last minute, but more both because of what the problems it causes for staff, but also just in the process of, if you want to be a co-sponsor and you want to work on the legislation, great, let's do it. But let's do it and then be part of that prior to its final passage.
Mayor
And if I-
Pro Tem, Mayor Pro Tem, on
Well,
that
I still
point.
have the floor and I want to respond to that. I think it's actually, in a perfect world, yes, co-sponsors know they're going to be co-sponsors and it's put in play. But those of us that are not included in certain co-sponsors or in working on legislation for whatever reason, don't know until later, like, oh yeah, I want to co-sponsor. This is important to me. And also we've had instances where the committee chairs or whoever's documenting our committee process and we say in committee, I want to be a co-chair or co-sponsor. Sometimes it doesn't actually get tracked. And there's times we're at council and they're like, oh, I actually had put my name during this committee and it wasn't put in place. So it's not necessarily always our fault that we're last minute deciding to do co-sponsorships. And it also has to do with legislation. So that's why I don't think the 72 hours, I think that's a goal for sure. But, I don't know if it needs to be like stated that that's a requirement. So, and then the red line, I agree with you. Yeah, there's things that make sense about changing, but there's stuff that actually was in the last version, the older version, that I was like, oh, I didn't even know that was actually in there. So it's stuff that I think would just be helpful to be like, oh, that was actually already in there. And this is stuff that's new. It's just helpful. So.
Mayor Pro Tem on that point as well.
Go ahead, Counselor.
Briefly, I know you have questions, but clearly I wasn't invited to be part of even this legislation. So it was just you, Councilor Beta and Councilor Cassett that made these changes, that had these discussions. I wasn't invited. I don't know if any of the other councilors were invited, but if we're gonna start making this a rule, then we're all gonna have to be invited to every piece of legislation. We're gonna deal with quorum issues. So I'm not sure how that's gonna work out, but I'm not sure it's quite fair to say that, if there's a piece of legislation out there that you want to be a part of, that you actually have to sit in on it, because we don't always have the invitation.
Right,
I didn't
and
have the
we
information
have the quorum issue, right? You're right, because so only 4 counselors. And that's why I'm saying I'm perfectly willing, once the thing has been made public, to add other co-sponsors. But it seems like we should be doing that, you know, earlier in the process, not at the very end. And I completely understand that sometimes translation doesn't get made when you add yourself as a co-sponsor and committee, and then you get to governing body. It's happened to me and my name isn't there. And I've said, hey, I added myself as a co-sponsor. Could you please correct that? So that kind of clerical error, absolutely we should be fixing. And we should allow for more co-sponsors. That's a good thing, right? But it's just, let's do it sooner rather than later in the process. And we, you know, again, for instance, this group, there are 3 counselors who've been working on this. We bring it out to you. Absolutely want your feedback. If you would like to co-sponsor, I hope you will. If you want to make changes, I hope you will. And we're taking notes about what you're seeing and the points you're bringing up, so that we can have further conversation about it. So it's not that we're trying to exclude people. It's just like, we want everybody to join on sooner if that's something they're interested in doing. And that's helpful to the staff. And I think it's helpful, you know, to just the process. And I'll stop because I know Councillor Lindell wants to ask some questions.
Okay, Councillor Villarreal, you still have the floor.
Thank you. For the posting of the agenda and supporting materials, we talk about copies of the agenda and packet materials shall be available to the governing body and the public for study and review the Friday immediately prior. And for presentations in particular, we never meet that, except for us at the task force. We got it in time and all the other presentations didn't. So I'm just wondering, is this a new rule then, that even presentations by staff members and other groups that will be presenting, that they need to get that even presentation packet material completed that Friday before a governing body meeting?
Does anyone know the intent of that within this presentation?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal, it doesn't specify, you know, legislation must be included, contracts must be included. It's just all packet material. So if there is a actual presentation, I think that that would theoretically be included.
Right. So the
And Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal, I believe we've defined packet material. So Jesse, I think it's in the definitions, right? So I think the intent was to have at least the minimum materials necessary to vote on an item. So if that is the definition, then I think it was intended for legislation specifically. And the idea being that if a request is made for additional information, requiring that to be available on the Friday before is difficult. And we don't want to exclude something, even if there's more responses that we can provide. If we can add to the materials to help folks with materials that wouldn't be otherwise required, then I think we would still want to be able to add. But I don't remember the exact definition that we came up with for packet material, but the idea is that at least the FIR, the memo, and the bill, that type of thing would have to be in the packet. I'm not sure how broad the definition ended up, and it may have had unintended consequences if it was broader.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell and Councilor Villarreal, it defines packet material as the minimum documents necessary for the governing body to take action on the relevant items. So I think maybe it wouldn't apply to presentations since you don't take action on them. And also it would, as it says, the minimum documents. So you would need at least the legislation and probably the FIR and memo. So that does, I think, it is with the understanding that there could be supporting materials that are that would be available later on and not necessarily that far ahead of the meeting.
Okay, so that doesn't apply to presentations then, from what I'm hearing from you.
Well, this is a study session. These are things that we're bringing up and that can be brought forward should you choose to. Again, a reminder, we're at a hard stop at 7 o'clock.
I realize that. I don't know if anyone else got a time limit to talk. So
I'm only asking to leave me a few minutes to speak. That's all I'm asking.
I hear you. And I also feel like there's other questions I have that I guess we'll just have to wait till committee.
Counselor Lindell hasn't had a chance to ask questions yet either.
I hear you, but I'm also taking my time to ask questions. So the other ones that I have, I guess I won't ask you, that are confusing to me, some languages. So I guess it'll have to wait till next time.
Perhaps you could send them out to Jesse and the sponsors, and they could provide some answers on them. I will try to make mine quick. And I won't ask for specific answers. I will just identify areas that I'm concerned about and that I think may need more work. I do have concern about the first public comment on bills. And part of that is that I think that having public comment on bills when there's been no presentation on them has a high level expectation of the public to have read the legislation and not to just be having an opinion that they heard from their neighbor or they read about on Nextdoor. Because it's very, very clear that during that public comment, the governing body will not be discussing or commenting. So someone has the ability to stand up and say something that is perfectly untrue, and we just sit and grit our teeth and listen to it. That's very problematic to me. And then I think that it may unnecessarily extend our meetings and accomplish very, very little purpose. So that's one area. The next thing was on page 6, and I am wondering about the ordering of legislation going through committees, having finance be last. The next item that I was looking at is on page 12. It's near the top of the page, item 9. I appreciate that governing body encouraged to communicate prior to meetings what items will be pulled. We used to have a staff member call and ask people, what items do you intend to pull? I'm not opposed to having that happen again. I would also not be opposed to having an email go out the morning of council meetings to all councilors requesting what items they intend to pull from consent. We've wasted a tremendous amount of staff time having people be in the room waiting to see if their item is going to be pulled, when all we have to do is send an email or make a phone call. I also think it's disrespectful of staff time that they could be home with their families having dinner. On page 14, just bringing up a point, under E, number 1B, talking about you cannot allot your time in petitions from the floor to another member of the public. I'm fine with that. But they may make arrangements with the city clerk to speak in a specific order. I'm not really sure why we would grant that to a person or a group or the purpose of that. So that's something I'm just looking for a little more information on. I just heard, I saw it in here. I didn't mark it up, but I'm not really sure why it makes a difference to us if someone gives their address or if they give the district number that they live in. Why we needed a change with that. But as I said, I know this committee is not done and that we're bringing things up that we may have questions or have concerns about. And those are the ones that initially in going through this that I had concerns about. Probably the one that I'm least comfortable with is the first public comment on bills. That I don't know if I have the ability to sit and be quiet while someone gives public testimony that is absolutely inaccurate and incorrect. I think that's really asking a lot of each and every one of us, and to not give any background on it, or, you know, a lot of opinion is formed through social media that is not based on anything other than wrong information or anger or whatever. So that's one that really is very problematic for me. So we are at 6:58. City Attorney McSherry, do you have any final comments that you need to make for us?
Thank you for that opportunity, Councilor. The one thing I would say is the city clerk part, I think, is in the existing rules. And what I would look at maybe for this request that we have, maybe we can block out sections and say like new section or rearrange section rather than realign. You know what I mean? Like kind of block out sections and just put a comment by it, like say like no changes but moved or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Does that sound like it might help?
I think
nodding.
that
Okay,
would be helpful to folks. And Councilor Villarreal, I hope that you will put the rest of your questions down and get them over to the committee. I'm sorry that you got cut short on it. And I do want to also clearly thank the folks that have worked on this. I mean, it's obvious to me, I've been in this seat for some time. This took a lot of work, a huge amount of work, and I'm appreciative of it. And I don't want the committee that worked on this to feel like all we're doing is throwing bombs at them, because I think that it's worthwhile, and I think that it's heading us in the right direction. So with that, we are going to be adjourned. Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I can real quick.
Go ahead, Councilor.
Before you adjourn, I just want to make sure that this comes to Public Works and Public Utilities before moving on. So that's all I want to say about that. I want to make sure it comes to my committee before moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, folks, we'll have, I know we'll all have another shot to chat about this, and I appreciate everyone coming to a special study session. So good night, and we are adjourned now.